Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us today for the GIS Sustainability training. So this is the B3 class about the state toolkit. We had B2 just, I guess it was in May, where we really reviewed the toolkit and talked about how to prepare your data for NG9-1-1. So I'm Annie Cahill. I'm GIS Technical Manager with Michael Baker, and I have with me Becca Mangan. I'm more on the strategic planning side. Becca is on the data side, so she works with all the GIS data with our company and gets it cleaned up and all that stuff. Restrooms are right around the corner. And then for today's class, we actually don't have a virtual classroom for you. We're just going to demo this and you know, share my screen so you can just kind of relax and watch the demo. So there's some links here on this slide. We have the link for B1 that we did at the very beginning of the year, the link to B2, which is not 8 hours. That one was cut in half because I did that class. It was a recording. It was only 4 hours, so that was just not a live class. It was just me. And then I have the link for the standard and toolkit download. The version that's out there right now for download is version 4, and the State of Oklahoma data website. So what we're going to do today is kind of recap the toolkit and go over the functionality. We're also going to review the MPAG tools high level. We're going to talk about validations and data remediation, and then Becca's going to show you the check row DSN values and those comparison tools because those were not ready in the last class. We're going to talk about submitting your data and uploading it to the repository, and then best practices and recommendations. So did you attend B2? Yay! This one hopefully will not be as challenging for you, Trump. Oh my goodness. Okay, so we're going to look at the toolkit functionality real quick. So I will go ahead and review from 3.2. So and just so you know, this is being recorded so that you know we can put this out on the state's website. That's the purpose of this recording. So if you're watching this recording, oh, it's not. I thought it was share. Okay, hang on. Share. Screen 1. Share. Okay. Yeah, so if you're watching the recording, guys, we have one student in class today, so she's getting an extra special one-on-one class. Yeah, so this is just going to be very short and sweet today. We won't have a lot of discussion, I don't think, but you know it'll still be good. So remember from B2 we discussed the OK Prep tools. Oh, and we do have Charles on the line. Charles, I don't know if you want to say hi. Just let everybody know you're here.
Hey, it's me. Hello, guys. Or actually, ladies. No guys yet. They're here. I'll be quiet.
Okay. So with the OK Prep tools, we have the Create Geodatabase tool, and that was the tool that we use to get all of our GIS data into a standards compliant geodatabase. Okay, and that standards compliant geodatabases has the appropriate coordinate system. It also has all the domains set, and it also is going to create that that NG9-1-1 feature data set that's really important for you know, storing all of your feature classes. Then we have, oh, and I'll just open this up so you can review this real quick. So you can see here that the tool does allow you to import already standards compliant data in these parameter boxes, but you can also create blank feature classes if necessary. So if you were missing ESDs or something like that, you could go ahead and create them. Then you have all these field mapping tools available to you. So we did talk about how you need to pre-assess your data and make sure that you know what fields your data has within it, and then determine what can be field mapped over into the state schema. So we have a road field mapping tool. That's the one that we showed you the last time. Remember in B2, we only had you field map 4 of those fields because, yeah, it's a lot.
Well, Charles told me to pick your brain.
Yes, pick our brains. We will answer any and all questions that we can. And if we can't, then we'll just throw you to Charles. We'll pick on him. So the adjustment tools were some really good tools that you can use for QC. You can use the fixed domain case, and what that's going to do is it's going to take any field that has a domain applied, and it will transform those values into uppercase. The fixed MSAG COM spaces drops leading and trailing spaces from the MSAG COM fields within the geodatabase. The fixed street type and direction, we had an extensive discussion about this tool. Remember that all of the street type fields, all of the street element fields within the road center lines and the address points, those absolutely have to be fully spelled out. Okay, so you know, all of your suffixes, your pre-directionals, all of those need to be fully spelled out to support the NINA data model. Correct. For the NINA fields. And you do have the option here within the tool to transfer the legacy fields, which are the abbreviated ones that you're using today, to transfer those into the legacy fields within the data model. And I can bring up the data model here. Not that one, this one. So this is the road center line schema. So all of the road center line elements need to be spelled out, okay? But then there's also space in the data model where you can store your legacy values, okay? So those would be your existing like abbreviated values. You can put them in those fields, and the tool can help you with that. Okay.
So are we gonna? I know Charles was looking at that. Are we gonna be quick to go through there and explain that all up to spell everything out?
So the question was, and I'm just going to repeat the question so that everybody on the recording can hear. The question was, is the expectation that localities need to fully spell out everything before uploading it to the repository? And the answer is yes, because those are mandatory fields. They have to be filled out appropriately. So anything that is an error is going to prevent submission. So those do need to be fully spelled out, but is going to be fully spelled out to highway. But if you notice here within the model, these have domains applied to them. So that means that as you're editing your GIS data, it provides like a pick list of sorts. So you don't have to sit there go through every single record and hand spell out everything. This fixed street type and direction tool is going to do that for you. Okay, but then going forward, you're going to use that domain as you're editing your data. So when somebody adds in a new road center line or a new address, you're just going to, yes, oh, that's you, okay. So then you would just click the drop down and then choose the appropriate suffix, which in a way is better, because that way you know that what you're picking is correct. So if you're in a hurry, you know, you don't have to worry about, am I spelling something right, you know, et cetera. And then the Fix Submit tool, that populates all of the values within the submit field with a Y, which tells the toolkit that yes, I want to submit this for validation. The FixTopoAccept, remember the TopoAccept field is only in the road center line feature class. So when you're going through and you are editing your data, when you run your topology on your road center lines, what you're going to want to do is mark exceptions where necessary. So if you have, you know, 25 cul-de-sacs, they're going to flag as dangles, and you want to go through and mark those as an exception, a dangle exception. So what the FixTopoAccept tool does is that takes everything that was not marked as an exception and transforms that field to no exception, because it's either an exception or it's not. And because that's a mandatory field, you cannot have any blanks or nulls. Okay? Any questions? The comparison tools Becca's going to show you today. The enhancement tools we talked about extensively. The AdValidate NG9-1 topology basically runs a topology on your NG9-1 geodatabase. All right. And what that does is it looks at the spatial relationships between your different feature classes. Okay. And remember that you can always go back to the README. Whoops. You can always go back to the README if you have questions about what's being shown or what the rules are. So remember, you can open the README. If I have a question about what's being looked at here, then I can look at the topology rules, and I can learn what the rules are for each feature class and how they're being compared to one another. Okay? So don't forget that when you're working through the toolkit, your README is your best friend. All right. The assign unique NINA ID, we talked about that a lot as well. The unique NINA ID, which is also called the NGU ID, which is the NINA globally unique ID, is a truly unique field. Well, it's a field that supports truly unique values for every single record within your feature class. So every single segment of your road center lines has to have a unique ID. Every single address point, every single polygon, every individual piece of data needs to have its own unique ID. And we talked about the fact that this is a concatenation of what the feature class is, the actual unique ID itself, the number, and then the agency ID. And the agency ID is really what sets it apart, because that's the domain that's specific to your agency within your state. So we're not going to get confused with Washington County, Florida, and Washington County, Oklahoma. And that's really for error reporting, right? So if you have a duplicate street name like Elm Street, then it's going to know, okay, well, this is the Elm Street in Oklahoma and not in Florida. All right. The calculate label, it concatenates all of the road center line street elements, basically all of the NINA fields that are fully spelled out. Okay, so all those street elements that are fully spelled out, it concatenates those, puts them in the label field. Now, it's going to be a really long label, so this might not be something that you would want to use to label your maps because, you know, highway, boulevard, those are really long street names. This is a field that's used by other tools within the toolkit for their functionality. Okay, so if you have a label using your legacy fields where you have your abbreviated street suffixes and things, you should still go forth and use that for labeling. But this label field is for that additional functionality, okay? The calculate parity calculates the parity on the left and right side of the road based on the road ranges. That's pretty straightforward. Becca's going to show you the check road ESN values today. The find address range overlaps looks at the address ranges in your road center lines and then determines if there's any overlapping ranges there. And it generates a notice, not an error, okay? And the reason it generates a notice is because it's actually using fields for the functionality that are considered conditional within the data model. But please fix that. Please, please fix your overlapping ranges, even though it only generates a notice. It's just going to bother me. If I know that's in your data, it's going to keep me up at night. Okay, so the Fishbone Analysis, we talked about that. And what that does is it actually, can that go away? No. Oh, why that's not going away. Okay. Anyway, the Generate Fishbone Analysis is a visual geocode of the quality of your addressing. Okay, so it's going to look at the actual location of where your addresses are geocoding to on that road center line. Remember, we showed you an example in the last class where we had a road center line and all of the addresses were geocoding to like the first third of that road center line, because that particular center line was using theoretical ranges instead of an actual range, and so everything was geocoding really tight down at the bottom of that street. And it also, the tool will also help you identify any areas where you have addresses that are out of order, which is really important. So it's a really quick visual snapshot of the quality and health of your addressing. The Geocompare tool, it populates the RCL match field in the address point feature class. So what this does is it looks at all of your address points and it seeks to find a matching road center line segment. So it goes down every address point and it says, yes, I found your road center line segment, buddy, and that is going to be this NGU ID. So it's going to identify the NGU ID of the corresponding road center line. If it doesn't find one, then it's blank, okay? It leaves it blank, but because it's a mandatory field, it has to be populated. So that's when you would use the next tool, which is populate RCL match, no match. And what that does is it takes anything that, that has a null value and it basically puts the value of no match in there, okay? Any questions so far? All right. We are going to talk about the MPAG tools today. We're going to talk about the submission tools. And then as far as the validation tools, we did review this extensively. You can do a check all required on the data. I think that was probably the first thing that we showed you. Remember that if you're confused or you're wondering what the validations do, then you can always look at the README. So if we scroll down to the check all, we can see here what's being checked, okay? We can see here that all of these checks are being performed against these different data layers. At the same time though, if you don't want to get overwhelmed with the check all, you can also run checks and validations on individual feature classes, which is what you see here, okay? And that can really help you organize your work a little bit better. It can help you manage the workload. You know, if you say, hey, look, I'm going to take the next month and work on address points, you can do that instead of doing the check all. And then also remember that you have this option to clear the results table. Remember that as you're running your validations, the results are going to be dumped into that field values check results table, and the clear results is going to clear those out, because if you don't clear them out in between your different runs, what's going to happen is it's all going to stack on top of the previous runs. So make sure you get into a good habit of clearing out that table in between your validations. The field values check results. It's a table that's generated when you do your validations. Okay. Any questions about the toolkit, Shelley? Okay. Can you see my PowerPoint, Becca, in the WebEx? Okay. All right. So just a recap, and I mean, I already went over the functionality, but this is the state-provided toolkit that you're going to use to prepare your GIS data. You need to approach it as a toolkit. Don't look at it as a wizard. We did provide to you a suggested workflow in B2, but that's just a suggested workflow based on our experience with our clients' GIS data. Where some people have some layers, but they're missing others, and they're definitely missing a lot of the fields that are required, and they're not maintaining the fully spelled out NINA values. So, we provided that suggested workflow in B2, but you need to look at the toolkit as you're going to pick the right tool for the job. Okay, just like you would when you have your toolkit at home and you need to repair something within your home. You're not going to use every tool in your toolbox unless you're me and you don't know what you're doing and you have no home improvement skills. But anyway, so yeah, that's how you have to approach this, okay? Also, we did talk about this extensively as well, as assessing your data before you go through this effort. kind of do your gap analysis on paper, right? Make a checklist of what the state needs for layers. Look through your geodatabase or your shape files and say, I have this, I don't have this. And then that's going to help you really understand your level of effort and what you're going to need to do, okay? Because then, you know, it's not only identifying the missing layers, but then also, hey, what fields am I missing? How am I maintaining these fields today? How are these fields supporting my existing business needs? Do I need to have conversations with other people because maybe my address points is also supporting our permitting system, and I need to have a discussion about, you know, can I go ahead and adapt to the state's schema, or can I, you know, ETL, or should I just maintain a whole separate address point file, you know, from the start? So, you know, lots of questions you have to ask of the data when you're working with it. Okay, so Shelley, have you used the toolkit? Okay, that's just one of our polling questions. Since you're our only student, I'm just going to ask. All right, so the MPAG and Alley, these tools should be ready for the next toolkit release, which I think is going to be 4.2, and that's coming in the very near future. All right, so remember that the MPAG and Alley are two databases, and I don't know, I'm probably blocking that view, Shelley, I'm sorry. Let me collapse that, there you go. The MPAG and Alley are two tabular databases that are currently used for 911 call routing in today's environment, okay? The Alley is the automatic location information, and that's going to store all of the telephone numbers, the community information, the ESN for our civic locations. And then the MSAG is the master street address guide. That actually, if you're from the GIS world, that's going to look very similar to your road center line attribute table. It's going to have your street name, community information. It's going to have your ranges. You may store other information there as well. But this is what a typical MSAG and Alley look like. Shelley, do you maintain the MSAG and Alley for your community? And how do you update that? Do you log in, or do you? Mm-hmm. Okay. 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 Well, and I think, you know, that's a good thing that you have the ability to do that. A lot of people that we work with, they don't have the ability to update their own MSAG or Alley. Often they they don't even have access to it. And that's all over the place. We have clients who have never seen their MSAG or Alley. They request it from their telephone company, and it takes months and months and months. That's good. That's excellent. Mhm. That's awesome. Yeah, so I think and that's, your experience is pretty much the same that we found throughout the state. I mean, there's you know, you have access. Yeah. So different providers are a little bit different. And we do have a lot of people that we work with who don't have access to that information, or they have to pay for it, or it takes forever. And yeah, it is crazy. But the point in having the MSAG Alley discussion here today is because there are tools available in the toolkit to help you compare what's in your GIS with your MSAG and Alley. And the reason that this is important is because although the MSAG and Alley drives the call routing today, in the future, it's going to be on your GIS data. And the thing is that we have to make sure that the GIS data and the tabular data that are owned by the telephone companies are reflecting the same information. That's incredibly important, because it's not like, okay, just because you get your GIS data ready and you submit it to the state, that doesn't mean your MSAG and Alley are going away. It's going to be a long time before that happens. Exactly. The legacy is very current, you know, and it's going to stay for quite a while. So I don't want you guys to think, okay, well, I can trash my MSAG and Alley. We're over it. We got our GIS where it needs to be, because you're going to have to continue maintaining these databases. So we do encourage you to do an MSAG to road center line comparison, because you want the data to answer the same questions. That's really important. So as you are editing your GIS data, one of the things, and we should have put this in the best practices slide, but one of the things that we recommend when you are editing addresses or adding in new addresses is that you label your road center lines not just by the name of the road, but also by the range. That way, when you're doing address editing and management and you add in a new address, you can do a quick visual check to see what the high range of that road center line is. That way you know, hey, I have to adjust the range on this road, which would hopefully trigger, hey, I need to adjust the range in my MSAG. You need to make sure that it reflects the same information. Did you? Okay, yeah. So when I was in local government, we would get faxes from Verizon, and we would have to write in the correct information for these different streets and then send it back, and that's how we did our updates. That's before everything went online and got fancy. We also need to make sure that we're doing an alley to road center line comparison, and then also an alley to address point comparison. So everything should be reflecting the same information. So the tools that are available to you in the toolkit to prepare your MSAG or help assess your MSAG, there are 3 different tools. There's the Check AT&T telephone number list, which is what most of you will use. There's the Check Other telephone number list, and then the MSAG NG9-1 comparison. Now, it's my understanding that the whole state is on AT&T. However, if you're on a border county where you're potentially dispatching for other counties outside of state, you know, you may want to retain and use this Check Other. We did have someone in another class who said that he often deals with non-AT&T data because they dispatch outside of the state. So, yeah. Oh, good. Sure. Okay. Yeah. So that's the thing. I mean, most of you will use the Check AT&T, and that's really straightforward. You just provide your Excel of your telephone number list, and then you drop in your NG9-1 geodatabase. Now, the thing about this is that this is something that you're going to use after your data is ready. So it has to be standards compliant. You have to get your geodatabase into that standards compliant format, you know, using the Create GDB, field mapping, going through and making sure all those fields are populated. It's going to be looking at those community values to run that geocode of the telephone number list to the geodatabase.
So this is just the one.
This is landlines, correct. Anything that comes from that telephone number list, it's going to geocode. If it's got the community information associated with it, it's going to geocode, because that's the field that it's looking at. It geocodes a list of telephone number addresses against MSAG information in the NG9-1 APs and road center lines. So it's the community information, truly. And then the really cool one is, well, I mean, they're both pretty cool tools. It was just that they have to work on the outputs a little bit. The outputs are a little bit, they just need a little bit of work, pretty much. I was not seeing what I was supposed to see, but they should resolve that with the next release. So the MSAG NG9-1 comparison, what that does is it compares your Excel MSAG to your road center line feature class in your NG9-1 geodatabase. Like I said, that data has to be standards compliant before you run this tool. So this is something that you would do toward the end. It's going to identify segments that aren't in the segments in the MSAG that aren't in the road center line feature class, and then vice versa. It does take a long time to run. It does. The first time I ran this, it took me almost an hour. That was with the Beaver County data. And it's my understanding that that's a fairly small data set. So just be mindful of that. That might be something that you want to set up to run overnight, or, I don't know, Friday or over the Christmas break if you have a big locality.
We only have about
Under 50,000 in your county? Okay. So any questions about the MSAG tools? Okay. So let's move on to the submission tools. Okay. So our submission tools are really used to help us prepare basically our geodatabase for submission to the state repository. Okay. There are 3 tools available to you. There's the check data in zip, the GDB to shape files, and then the zip NG9-1 geodatabase. I'm just going to start with the GDB to shape files because that's not really for submission. But what that tool does is it takes your NG9-1-1, and again, this is one that has to be, standards compliant before you run this, but it's going to take all of the feature classes in your NG9-1 geodatabase, and it's going to just convert them to shape files. Because a lot of you still need shape files for your CAD system or your 9-1 system, or for any reason you might still need shape files. And that's pretty common across the board that we see with a lot of folks is they're still using shape files for a lot of these different applications, okay? So this tool just takes the geodatabase and exports everything in it to shape files. Zip NG9-1 geodatabase is just going to take that geodatabase and it's going to zip it up. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. This is one that, you could just go ahead and run this tool if you were feeling super confident in your data and it's going to pass the validations. Because what's going to happen is you're either going to validate it on your computer or you're going to drop it into the repository and wait for that to validate. And it's the exact same validations. It's the toolkit validations. And that if you're waiting for the repository to tell you what the problems are with your data, you've really just added an extra step to your process. So my recommendation is always to just validate your data on your own PC. But if you don't want to, or you're confident in your data quality, then you could just go ahead and just straight up zip your geodatabase. But when you do that, you do have to provide an extension here. You have to provide a file path, and then you have to add a .zip to the end of it. Okay, so I can go ahead and show you that. So I can go ahead and zip up this data. And I have to add a .zip. So I have a path there with the .zip, and I'm going to click OK here. And then if I return to my repository folder, then I can see the zip file was generated. Very straightforward. Okay. So GDB to shape files is a simple export to shape files. Zip NG9-1 geodatabase is just going to zip the geodatabase. No checks, no validations before. It's just a straight zip tool. The check data and zip. What this is going to do is it's going to run a check all validations against your GIS data. And again, this is on a standards compliant geodatabase, okay? So it's going to run a check data and zip, and if it passes the validations, it will zip. If it passes the validations, it will zip. If it does not pass the validations, it will not zip. Now, this particular tool, when you run this, it's not going to give you any check mark, or you're not going to get, any little applause or anything like that. You're going to have to go into the geoprocessing results to see the status of that tool. Okay, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to zip up both of these so you can see, because one's going to pass and one isn't. So the beaverpass.gdb, that's the data that we know is going to pass. The standard data prepped, that's actually from the last class that we did. So that's that prep geodatabase that has over 10,000 anomalies in it. We showed that to you the last time. It's missing some fields. It's got some topology issues. There are quite a few things that are going on within that data. But we know that one will fail. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna run this check on both of them. And this is a good time to get a cup of coffee or, I don't know, take a break, because this does take a few minutes. All right. Hold on. Okay, so again with this tool, you are going to have to provide the full file path with the .zip extension. If you don't, the tool's not going to run. So I'm going to click OK here, and then it's going to have this dialog box, but this does take a few minutes. So this is a good time to pause, get a cup of coffee, run to the restroom, and we'll be right back. Okay, we are back, and I wanted to show you the results. Remember that we did run the check data and zip tool, and that's going to do a check all validations on your data, and then if it passes, it's going to zip the file, but if it does not pass, it's not going to zip. So I'm going to go up here because remember, you're not going to see like a checkbox or any type of notification. You're going to actually have to search for that a little bit. And the way that you do that is you click Geoprocessing, go down to Results, and in my current session, the check data and zip, you just expand messages. And so I can scroll down here and see Geodatabase passed all data checks, successfully zipped Geodatabase. So it tells me that it successfully zipped my Geodatabase. Now, I am going to pull up the session I did yesterday. Oops. So yesterday I ran the check data and zip on the preptest.zip. That's the file that came from that prep geodatabase that we used in the last class. And what we did was we ran that, and you can see here that I'm getting some notices and errors all the way down, right? And what it says is there were 10,889 issues with the data that will prevent a successful submission. And then it's referring me to check the template check results table to see what the results are. And then it said several issues with the data need to be addressed prior to submission. Data will not be zipped. Okay? So, again, you're going to have to kind of look for the results here. But I can confirm that my file zipped. So this is the one that zipped. Okay? All right. Any questions about those submission tools? Now, again, I do highly encourage you to run the check data and zip on your side because the repository, it's the same validations on their server. It's the exact same validations. It's just you're just adding another step in the process to let you know that your data is not where it needs to be or it is where it needs to be. Okay, so now let's talk about the upload process. So first of all of your data has to pass the validations. Okay, you have to have data that passes. You can't have any errors. So when you run those checks on your data, and you see that you're getting a lot of errors, you have to resolve those. Even one error, you have to resolve it. Notices don't prevent submission, but errors do. Okay, so this is the repository homepage. Now, I do want to briefly talk about what the repository is before I give you the demo here. The repository really gives the PSAPs that functionality to store the GIS data, which is nice because it is kind of almost like a backup for your GIS data. Update that data because you can provide updates as frequently as you want. You can validate that data on their server, or you can validate it on your computer, whichever you prefer. And then finally, it allows you to merge that data into OK Maps. That's the ultimate goal here, is to get that data into OK Maps for the statewide NG9-1 data set. Whoops, I went right past all of those slides. Okay, the user roles. So the repository has roles set within it. And depending on what your role is, that's going to really dictate the functionality that you have access to, okay? So roles are assigned at the PSAP level. You can be a member of one PSAP or you can be a member of multiple PSAPs. Each PSAP is going to have one admin, but unlimited read or write roles, okay? The read role is the most basic. You're going to be able to see the status list of the PSAPs, and you can download the merged or archived files. Now, in this class, we're using merged and archived interchangeably because in the user guide for the repository, those terms are used interchangeably. So merged is the process of merging the data into OK Maps, but then once it's there, it's archived and you can download it, okay? So at the read role, you can see the status list and download basically the merged or archived files, which are the ones that pass the validation. Those are already in OK Maps and they can download that data. The write role can actually upload new data and they can download the original. Now here's what the original is. The original is all of the, it's all of the data that was in the original. Okay, so maybe you've gone through your assessment, you're in the process of prepping your data, you've realized that the state standard, the state model meets all of your requirements that you need for GIS data, but maybe you have like 5 or 6 fields that you have kept in, you know, from your previous schema. Okay, so maybe you have some extra fields in there and you've just chosen to make it all one big data model, and that's fine. You can do that. As long as you meet the minimum requirements, you can add in fields if you need to. A lot of people do that, okay? What it's going to do is the validations obviously are only going to run on those required fields. It's going to ignore all the extraneous, okay? But when you upload that and it gets merged in, those extraneous fields, like say you have in your address point, say you have a field that identifies the parcel number on which the address is located, okay? Maybe you maintain that in your data. What's going to happen is that is going to be dropped before it merges into OK Maps. What goes into OK Maps is only going to be what's required by the data model. So if you have 5, 10, 20 fields that you're maintaining in addition to all of the standard data, it's going to drop those. But when you're a write role, you have the ability to download the original, okay? So that's going to be the original data with all of any extra fields, with any anomalies, et cetera. It is kind of like an offsite backup. It could be, yeah. But it depends on your role. Like I said, if you're a read, you can only get what's been merged. So that's only going to have the fields that are required by the state. But if you are a read role, or I'm sorry, a write role or an admin role, then you can download the original data, okay? So then an admin also can do the same things that the read and write account can do, but then they also have more say in the roles and getting that assigned, et cetera. And then, of course, the state's going to function as a system admin. Now, there is a process for requesting an account. So the request comes into Shelley's office, the OGI, from the repository, okay? That request is forwarded to Lance's office, the 911 Management Authority. When it gets to his office, they're going to reach out about things that, you know, you need to fill out regarding data sharing, et cetera. This is the stuff that's still being worked out by his office. We don't have a clearly defined process yet with all the details, but this is kind of like the loop that's going to occur. Okay, so you're going to work with his office, fill out the required paperwork. Once that request is granted, he's going to notify the OGI, and then they will approve your login request. So that's the loop. Okay, so any questions about that login process or account request? Okay. This is the home page for the repository, okay? There's 2 buttons. You have login and sign up. If I click the sign up button, it's going to take me out to the identity server, and this is where you would go to request your account, okay? You're going to fill out this information. When you go to choose your, I don't think the site is out there just yet. I think it's coming soon, very soon. Once you get here, though, I would really encourage you to pull up the user guide for the repository, because there are very strict password requirements, and you're not going to be able to use the same password for this that you use for all your other stuff. And I'm not directing that at you, that's directed at me, because I use the same password for everything. IT people everywhere are just ashamed. It's fine. But anyway, you're going to need to reference that because that's going to give you the guidelines about how to develop your password, okay? So I'm going to go to login and log into my account. This is going to be your home page, My PSAPs. Now, because I have an admin account, I'm seeing every single PSAP. What you see on this screen is going to be determined by the role that you have and the PSAPs that you have access to, okay? You might see one PSAP, you might see 25 PSAPs, okay? So if your screen doesn't look exactly like mine, don't be surprised because this is an admin account. You know, you're going to see what you have access to. All right. All right, so this is the status page for the My PSAPs. You're going to be able to see the PSAP name. So I can sort this, or I can click the magnifying glass to search, or I can just scroll down and use the paging controls here to page through the different PSAPs. The last upload validation status is either going to be invalid or valid, okay? Refers to the toolkit validation. The last upload merge status, when it merged or when it uploaded, was it merged? It's either pending or complete. Pending means that it's not. Complete means that it did merge. The date of that last upload, and then the last successful upload date. All right? Just because you uploaded it doesn't mean it was successful. If it was invalid, you're not going to have a successful upload date. Make sense? Okay. So I'm going to pick on Adair County because they're at the top of the list. So when you're going into your PSAP for the first time, this is the page that you're going to see. It says no files have been uploaded yet. So what you're going to need to do is upload a new file here. So you would just click upload a new file and then go through this process. But I just wanted to show you what this is going to look like when you are logging in for the first time. Now I'm going to go down to Beaver County because we like to pick on them. And this is the information that you're going to see about your individual PSAP. This is the PSAP status page, okay? You're going to see the upload date, the name of the file, the validation status of that particular run, the date of that validation, the merge status, the merge date, and then the archive status and date. So obviously the validation status, it's either going to be invalid or valid, the date that you ran it. The merge status is either going to be pending or complete. So the merge and the archive status are directly related to the validation. If it passes, if it's valid, then it's going to merge the data and become archived. If it doesn't pass the validation, if it's invalid, you can see here, it's invalid. It's going to remain pending, which implies that, you know, it's just going to hang out there and pending. It's not ever going to merge or archive. Okay, does that make sense, Shelley? All right. So the merge and archive status are directly related to that validation status. Now I want to draw your attention to the actions column here because I have the ability to download the original because I'm an admin account. I can download the original or I can download the merged. Okay. So remember that the original data has all of the extra fields plus any anomalies. The merged is the data that is only the standards compliant data that's been merged into the rest of the data. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and upload a new file. And I'm going to just choose one of these. It has to be a zip file. It says here it must be a zip file. That's why the submission tools require you to give that .zip extension. And then I'm going to click Save Upload. It's going to tell me that my upload was successful, but what that does is it drops it here at the top of the list with today's date, and it shows the validation status of pending. So it's in the queue to be validated. And what this is doing is it's basically waiting to run through the toolkit on the server. All right? And that takes a few minutes. It might take more than a few minutes, depending on your internet connection. Now, this is, you're kind of seeing now what I was trying to explain earlier. It's really better to do the validations on your machine, because if you're waiting here, you know, you're either going to have to keep refreshing the page, or you're just going to have to wait for the email to come in. All right, so I can show you what that looks like. Let's see here. Go through my, here we go. All right. So when you complete your validations, you're going to get one of two types of emails, okay? You're going to get an email that says successfully processed and then the name of your file, and then it'll say, Dear PSAP, the processing of the uploaded file has finished successfully, okay? And that takes a few minutes to come in. Or if it fails, then you will see all of the errors within your data dumped into this email. So it'll say validation failed, and then it'll say, Dear PSAP, the validation has failed with the following results. And then it's going to drop in all of those anomalies that were identified. Yeah, now remember, this is that prep geo database that we used in the last class, and there were over 10,000 anomalies. So it drops those into an email. And this is basically the field values check results table. I mean, this is the results that are generated out of that validation, okay? So this is why I think it's better for you to run the validations on your machine, because to be honest with you, this is not going to be valuable to you. This is just telling you in an email a quick snapshot of what's going on. Exactly. Got to go do some more work. So I don't know. I mean, are there any questions, Shelley? I don't know if I'm... Charles, did you have anything you wanted to add about this? Putting you on the spot there.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I was trying to find which mouse I was supposed to be working with. I was talking right away, and I was on mute. No, I think that's pretty much it. The tools are the exact same, whether you're using the repository or whether you're using them local. It's by far the smartest thing to run them local. You get to see the progress. You get to see more of a report that you can function with. It's the same information, but a whole lot more tangible and ingestible if you run it local. So.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, this is going to take a few minutes to run. It's going to have a pending status, and then what's going to happen is you'll see that the validation status will go from pending, and then it'll change to either valid or invalid, depending on the results. And if it failed, it'll just continue to say pending, and that's the status. And then it's not going to merge or archive. And then, of course, here you can see if it fails, the only option is to download the original. All right, but if you were a read account, you could not do that. Okay. So I'm going to go in here and open up the OK Maps so that you can see. All right, so this might look, have you been on this site, Shelley? I mean, this might look familiar to you.
Yes, I have.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, and for those of you watching the recording, you know, this is the OK Map site. I mean, you guys have probably used this before. But notice on the left here, you have all these different categories of data available to you. 911 is not one of them, okay? But if I click the login button and I log in, you notice here that 911 data is now available. So I can click on 911, and if I click on address points, I have different options, right? So I can download it, I can add it to the map, so I'm going to go ahead and add it to the map, and you can see I have some data there that gets added. So this is the ultimate goal of this data, is to be able to add this into OK Maps so that you can go in, take a look at it, and download it. And the question has been asked in previous classes, will we be able to download the data of our neighboring PSAPs? And I think that is the ultimate goal. Lance's office is still working out the details regarding all of the legal aspects, which is part of the reason, that's part of that account loop request process that we were talking about, because they need to have this paperwork filled out and understand really the legal surrounding that downloading and sharing of data. Yes. And a lot of you, so Shelley just said that they currently share the data with the surrounding, and that's very common with a lot of PSAPs across the country. They share data, like even in Virginia. I mean, we just do open data in general. But when you talk about 911 data, you know, people start to get a little bit squirrely. I mean, and please, folks, make sure that, you know, you're not maintaining any PII within your any of your data sets. Yes. Personally identifiable information. Sorry. Okay. And most people don't. Like, I'll be. Okay. Yeah. And fortunately, before the data is merged into OK Maps, like I said, any extraneous fields are dropped. But do you still want your writers and your admin to be able to download data that might have someone's health information in it? Yeah, you know what I mean? There is a liability there. And, you know, we did have a client who, you know, we were cleaning up their data for them, and they sent us their address points, and their address points had not only the telephone number, but also had information about individuals' health conditions and their names. Very, very personal information. And so we had to scrub our servers, and we had to have her sanitize that data before we were able to receive it again. But the only place where there could be a potential liability is that comments field. And I know Charles has talked about dropping that out of the standard. Within the address points, there is that comments field. I don't know if I went past it or not. I think I did. There it is. Comments and notes. It's conditional, but you do have, you know, room to drop in any comments. Like if somebody, I don't know, if there was information that was necessary. Yeah. Sure. And that's an appropriate use. Yes. That would be, yeah, that would be an appropriate use, like any additional information about the structure, you know, yeah. Yeah, but some people who may not understand, you know, the appropriate use of that field, or, you know, just general data maintenance practices in general, they may not be thinking about it. Yes. Yes, people move, yeah, information can change. Yeah, I know what you're saying. So just be very cautious when you're editing data, and be careful about what you choose to share, because although those, you know, any extraneous fields that are not required by the model, although those are dropped, you know, you still have the ability to add comments, at least for now, within the data model. So just be very careful about that. Are there any questions so far? Any questions about OK Maps or the repository? Because this is really the heart and soul of this class, is just making sure that you understand the purpose of why we have to get this data ready, what the end game is to have the statewide 9-1 data set, but then also to show you these other things too that we thought would be beneficial. Good? Okie dokie. So I'm going to bounce back over to the repository here. We are going to pause the recording for just a second. So, okay, I just wanted to show you guys the email that came in while you're waiting. So it took several minutes, but we did receive that email that told us that the processing of our file finished successfully. So when that happens, you know that the validations have passed and the data is okay, and it's going to be merged into OK Maps. So all I have to do here is refresh the screen, and you can see that today's upload of Beaver Pass was found valid. It gives me the date of the validation, and then my merge and archive status are both complete. All right, so are there any questions? Okay, so at this point, we are going to move on to the validations and remediation, and then Becca's going to show you those extra tools from the toolkit. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and I'm going to hand it over to Becca now.
I wanted to make sure I was sharing my screen, so I'm going to jump back and reiterate our discussion. Pulling up the toolkit again, we have our validation tools here, and I'm going to go through these. This check all required is what we ran after we completed B2, and it's going to, when you run this check all required, it'll take care of all of these other checks in the validation tools toolkit. So, and what gets exported from that is not only our field values check results table, which will have the every record for the anomalies that came back, but there's also some feature classes that get exported as well. So there's that spatial component that you can use to help remediate your data. Okay, so I have this map package set up, and I have some of the layers from our results pulled in here symbolized. So I have it broken out as over here are the validations, our fishbones, some of the feature classes that are going to be related to the examples I have today. And then we have our master data sets here. Okay. I'm going to jump to our first example. And we're going to look at address range overlap. And right now I have the feature class pulled in, and it's symbolized in this red. So it's a quick visual of which two road segments, and I have it overlaid, which two road segments have a range overlap. You can also find this information in the field values check results table. And by searching, I always look here at the check field because it gives that description of the checks. And if you go in here and you search overlapping address range, we can also see all of the center lines that had overlapping address ranges. You know, here is your NG ID, which is that unique ID that joins back to the feature class. So if you wanted to do a join on the table to your data, that's another way that it can, you know, you can quickly sift through the data. But I personally love having the visual. So let's zoom in here and let's take a look at the ranges. So when there's a range overlap situation, sometimes it's pretty straightforward. Like in this case, these segments are, you know, consecutive, and I always like to let's just do a comparison. So I see this segment has the from range value of 18,000, but this segment also has the from range value of 18,000. So let me open up this attribute table, and let me select these two. So I always like to look in the attribute table and just do a quick. So if I'm going to update this, we want to make sure we're considering the big picture, which is our address points as well. But I'm going to increment up. So the overlap is happening. We need to adjust the from value of this adjacent segment. So I'm going to increment up 2 values to turn it to 18,301. Therefore, there's no more overlap happening, and the centerline ranges are consecutive. And now I'm going to look at the address points and make sure those are considered in the range update that I just made. So 18,302 is going to be represented in this range. 18,305, everything looks good. We've eliminated that overlap situation. And that's a quick way to resolve a range overlap. I will say, you know, if you're maintaining theoretical versus actual ranges, that's something you want to be mindful of as you update the attributes here, whether you use actual values. So look at your address points and what's actually represented there and update the attributes like that. Oh. Okay. Okay. Yep. Good compliment. Okay. Oh. Okay. So I have a second example here. And this is, I want to draw attention to utilizing the fishbones to really look at the health of your data. A fishbone is not a validation, but it is a great tool to use as you're, you know, updating and fixing your data. So let me remind. So the fishbone is, well, it's a funny term, but what it is, it's a visual relationship of the address point to where that address point is found within the road range. So it'll draw that line to where it's geocoded along the appropriate road center line. And I think it's a great tool to use just as first glance, QA/QC, just checking out what is actually happening between your address points and road center lines. So in this case, what we're looking at here, you see a lot of crossing fishbones happening, which tells me there's something I want to look into here. And when I'm remediating data, I see this kind of symmetrical crossing happening, and that's an indication that it might not be an address point issue. It's most likely a road center line fix that I need to do. So I'm going to turn this off so we can get a better idea of what's happening. I always want to assess the situation. So I'm looking at the address points. They're even on this side. It's increasing going in this direction. But as I look at my road segment, currently the right side of the segment, because the end point is here, the right side is over here. Exactly. So the right is saying it's even over here, odd over here, but we also want our road to be digitized in the direction of increasing address values, right? So the fix here is to flip this segment. And now if we reevaluate, the right side is reflecting the appropriate address points. And when you rerun the fishbone, because it's not going to regenerate, right? You have to rerun the fishbone tool. And if we think about what's going to happen now, this 2500 is going to geocode here. So now there's going to be no more crossing fishbones. It's going to be appropriately, we like it when it's perpendicular to the line. That's a really healthy fishbone. And so that's the situation to resolve this. Like I said, this is not a validation, but it is a QA/QC tool to use as you go through and you make sure that your data is in the best state that it needs to be. So no questions about that, Shelley? Okay. All right, let's jump to another example. Another fishbone example. And I want to talk about when a fishbone does not draw, right? That's a good indication that something is mismatched between your points and your center lines because that relationship couldn't be found, right? There's a couple situations that what could cause this could be that the address point is not, the road center line is not reflecting the appropriate range to consider the address points. Maybe the street attributes are mismatching. Maybe the incorporated municipality value is differing, or the parity of the road. So there's certain attributes we want to look into. In this case, we can see that as I'm looking at it, the address values are represented in the road ranges, but the street name is different than the address points. So that fishbone was not able to be drawn. And if I'm going to be remediating this and fixing it, I first want to verify what the appropriate road name is, whether it's the road that needs updated with the east pre-directional to be included, or maybe the address points are incorrect. So, go throughout your research, make sure you have the appropriate update, but then you're going to want to make that change in your data. And then once you've gone through and you're doing your editing, then you can rerun validation or your fishbones, and this line should generate now, right? Because that relationship would be found. Okay. So, like I said, I use the fishbones as a QC tool. So these types of situations really draw my attention, just like the funky crossing fishbones, what's going on there, what is actually happening in the real world, and then when a fishbone is not drawn, I know to look into that more. Because you have to think, we can no longer think of data. I mean, I'm a GIS nerd, and I love my data, but this is a very important data, and I have to consider how the data sets are related, right? I can't think of address points as address points without thinking now about the center lines, right? We need to see big picture here. Okay. I'm going to jump to another example. Go to this duplicate point situation, and I'm going to go and pull up field values check results table. Let's clear this. I think I want to stop and actually jump back to the fishbone example, and I want to point out that this toolkit is exactly that. It's a toolkit. As you are editing your data, we need to be mindful that some of these tools will need to be reran, especially some of these enhancement tools. Because if I'm changing road ranges and maybe I'm flipping roads or swapping range left and right sides, I need to make sure that I rerun the calculate parity tool. Because if I'm going to go rerun validations, I need to make sure my data set has been updated since I've been editing. Same with that calculate label tool. Some of these are going to need to be iteratively reran. So the calculate label, our validations use that label field, which is a concatenation of all the street attributes. And when I go and I change a road name, I need to make sure I rerun that label so that it now reflects the change I've made in my attributes, right? So just wanted to point that out, that some of these tools are also a part of QC, right? Same with the adjustment tools. Maybe you need to fix street type in direction. It's just kind of a gut check before I go in to run validations again. I want to make sure that my data has been fully updated before I go and rerun validation. All right, so let's look at this duplicate point situation. And those can be found as well in this field values check results table. And I'm going to search for this address point frequency check. And that'll draw our attention to all the points that have identical attributes within it. So this is another situation where you can join back on your address point feature class by this unique ID, and it'll tell you where all those are located. But I'm looking at these 2 points right here, this 105 1 Street Southwest. And you can see that obviously it has matching address information. And in this case, it's a matter of verifying, does the address house number need updated? Does the street name need updated? Let me turn on my base map because we can assess a little more, but you're going to want to see what's happening in the real world. So I'd want to verify both of these addresses. Maybe this is 105 1 Street Southwest, and that's accurate. And this is the point that needs changed. Maybe this is not actually the access point, or this address is not 1 Street Southwest. Maybe it's actually meant to be A Street Southwest. So you have to kind of think about what the actual change is needed here to resolve the duplicate point situation. And this is kind of a single family home situation, but I'll say in my client's data, what I most frequently see is duplicate points with, apartment complexes that have multi-unit buildings that they just don't maintain sub-address information, right? So they'll have 10 points representing each individual apartment, but they're not maintaining that unit value. So you have 10 duplicate points with that main address. Yeah, and if you want to provide some input here, you can. Queen of sub-addressing.
Yeah, so a lot of our clients, they have their best interests in mind when they're dropping. They know, okay, my apartment building has 8 addresses, and they just drop 8 points there. Now, there's a lot of other questions about placement. What's appropriate? What's the best practice? Should we stack them? Should we, space them out? It doesn't really matter. That's not really as important. But when you're trying to show sub-addressing, every address needs to be truly unique. So if you can get down to the unit level, that's the best thing. If you can get the floor information, like a lot of these high rises, the data model allows for sub-addressing down to the seat, which is a huge undertaking. You really have to have a structured plan if you're gonna do that, especially given how, especially with the COVID stuff and people are changing their office layouts, try to accommodate social distancing and all that stuff. You have to have a plan if you're going to do that. But generally, if you can make everything unique and get to the floor level or the unit, that is going to be super helpful, because that only helps our first responders. You go to the unit, that's good. Yeah, and a lot of people, we talk about parcel placement versus structure placement, and I did a webinar a few weeks ago about best practices for address management. And one of the things we talk about is what is the best method of address point placement for these different applications for public safety. And so it was a chart that's actually pulled out of the NINA document for site structure address point placement. It's an informational document. It's not a standard. It's very loose for a reason. They don't want perfection to be the enemy of the good. For NG9-1, structure placement is the preferred method of managing your addresses. But if all you can manage because of your limited resources is parcel placement, then that's good enough. So that's really important to talk about, because I know that people want to show that there's more than one, but you have to make it unique, because you need to pack the record for your first responders.
And like Annie said, we definitely recommend maintaining at that unit level. It's really going to add a lot of value to your data. And the best advice I can give is, with your placement methodology and the way you're maintaining your data, just be consistent. That'll go a long way, especially as we move, into next gen 911. We have to have our plan put together and have that consistency across data sets. All right, any other questions about this duplicate point situation? Okay, go on to this last example. Let's talk a little bit about boundaries. So again, with the validation checks, when there's gaps and overlaps found, there are feature classes that get exported, and I love the spatial component of that. And here, what we're looking at, turn on my law boundary, is a gap that was found in the law boundary. So if I turn this off, right now I have it displaying. If I turn it off, you'll see there's a sliver here. And there's actually an address point that falls in that gap. With our boundaries, we really want to make sure that they're topologically correct, right? The last thing we want in boundaries is to have gaps and overlaps, especially with the PSAP. We want to make sure that calls are able to be routed and everyone's going to be taken care of. I don't know.
Yeah. So I can provide a little bit of input here, Becca. Remember that the goal of NG9-1 is to replace ultimately those tabular databases of the MPAG and Alley with the GIS data. And that's why I keep hammering on about how we're, as GIS professionals, becoming geospatial first responders, because the GIS data is being used to route the call, not the tables. So the GIS data is going to be used before the call ever comes into the PSAP. You need to ask certain questions of your data. These are boundaries for call routing. These are not municipal or legislative boundaries. You can change these. You can adjust them. We have to kind of do away with this old way of thinking where, you get the good old boys in a room and they start arguing about territory and funding and things like that. So you have to be very careful about that when you're designing these boundaries, and you have to work with your PSAPs. These are not GIS decisions. The PSAP folks are the ones who are going to be able to tell you, where is the appropriate response? Where are the areas where you're experiencing a lot of transfers? The other goal of NG9-1 is to get the call right on the first try. So we're trying to minimize transfers. If you have a right-of-way that extends outside of your PSAP and you have a neighborhood and it makes sense for your PSAP to respond, even if those parcels are physically located and those structures are physically located in another PSAP, that's a different discussion you're going to have. Because if it makes sense for you to respond because you can get there in 5 minutes versus the other PSAP and it takes them 10 or 15 minutes, then you have to make the best decision for the citizens. And you have that flexibility with those call routing boundaries. That's the important thing. So remember, your PSAP and your ESBs, those are boundaries for call routing. You can adjust those. Now, because your PSAP and your discrepancy agency boundary are maintained at the state level, there is a process that you have to go through to adjust those boundaries. So when you download those, make sure you review them thoroughly with your PSAP. The question to ask is, who gets the call first? Who gets the call in this neighborhood? Is this correct? And you can even bring in your MSAG. If you trust your MSAG and you know that your MSAG is doing its job, then you can say, hey, this is an extra way that we can verify that what we're saying about this boundary is correct. But you definitely need to have those conversations. You need to have them early and you need to have them often, because this data can change. New neighborhoods go up all the time. And it's just really important to stay on top of this.
Absolutely. So I was just showing here this example when you mentioned if you're having a lot of transfers or if there's the access point in a certain PSAP, to have that conversation and consider adjusting the boundary to encompass the actual addresses that are easily accessible from a different PSAP. So, all right, let's go back here. So let's get a little nerdy real quick for this GIS editing. Annie's laughing at me, it's fine. I want to talk about once we've determined the appropriate boundary or appropriate entity that needs to respond to this location. I know this is a small little sliver, but often I've seen it where there's large gaps and there's many features that fall within it. And you have to have that conversation of, okay, well, whose responsibility is this? So when I go through and I actually need to make the change and remediate these boundaries, one of my favorite tools to use is just out of the box Esri on this advanced editing toolbar. If you go to this create features and you select the feature class that you need to make the edit on, there's this autocomplete polygon tool, and this will fill any space in between other features within this feature class and make sure that the edges completely match. There's going to be no chance for a topology issue. So I simply just kind of draw a line across, and it's going to create polygons that fill that space, right? And then say I've determined that everyone's makes this selectable. I realize, okay, well, it needs to be within this boundary. I'm going to merge it to that one, and we're all good. And that gap is no longer there. I know it's topologically accurate. I can hear Charles talking to me right now from previous classes saying, well, this is, that's a small example, but this works on any shape where there's a gap. So I could cut this guy up and use that autocomplete polygon, and it's going to completely edge match to the neighboring boundary. So I just thought that's kind of a cool tip. All right. Are there any other questions with validations that you want to talk through? I know you probably haven't gotten. Okay. Well, I am going to demo a couple of the tools that have not, they were not ready in previous versions of the toolkit. So let's talk first about this check ESN values. Make sure I say it right. Check road ESN values tool, and it's in the enhancement toolbox. And what this does is it's going to take your road center line and look at the attribute information for the ESN values and compare it against the ESN values of the spatial location, right, where that boundary actually exists in that ESE boundary. So this is a tool that is run at the geodatabase level. You just throw it in there, and the results get dropped in the field values check results table. So for the purpose of speeding up this class, I've already ran it. You would just here path to the geodatabase you need to assess, and it's got to be your NG9-1-1 compliant, right, or your standard compliant geodatabase. You'd execute that, and then I'll show you up here. How do I get rid of this banner? So I can, yeah. Well, I can't, I have to, here, I'll just do this. I wanted to show the results here of this tool because I ran it earlier. And let's look at the messages in the results table. So it'll say it's completed the road ESN check, and there were 26 issues found, and it tells you the results are in this field values check results table, okay? So I'm gonna navigate there. And again, I'm gonna search on this check field to find those values that are associated with the ESN check. So this check road ESN values will have the records, and there's 26 of them, which is good because that's what our results window said. And what we're looking at here is it's going to tell you a description of the mismatch found, and it'll tell you the road center line unique ID that you need to look into. There's a couple different descriptions here. Sometimes it'll point out the left or right side that it doesn't match that physical location. In this case, that value is none, so it's not populated. So it'll point out that where it needs to be populated. It'll also tell you if both of the left or right side with the actual value written out here, 6216, does not match the physical location of 6204. And it'll also have this one of vulnerable segments doesn't match. Those seem similar, but this one gives you a little more information. Another thing I want to point out here is that these are notices, right? Notices do not prevent submission. As a best practice, what we suggest doing, since the ESZ boundary is required, you may as well maintain the ESN attributes in your data. And so, although this will not prevent submission with any of these mismatches to the physical location, best practice is to actually have your data reflecting what it needs to with relation to these boundaries. So let's search one of these. I'll search the unique ID, and we can zoom to it and kind of look at what's going on here. Let's choose this one. All right. So chances are this is likely along a boundary edge. And let me turn on my ESCs. I remembered to label it this time. Okay, exactly. So exactly what's happening here. I'm going to zoom over to our ESN values. So right now, this center line, and let me toggle this so you guys can see, there's the boundary edge, and I have it labeled with the ESN numbers. And right now, it's saying that both the left and right side is 6216. But we know that the left side of this segment should actually be 6204, because that's the boundary that it's representing and it's reflecting. So that's kind of how you need to utilize that table to point you to the roads that need to be looked into, and then obviously assess those values against that physical location, okay? All right. Lastly, let's talk about these comparison tools. And the comparison tool is going to be accurately working in the 4.2 version of the toolkit. That is going to be pushed out soon. It's not currently available, but these comparison tools, I like to call them kind of it's not something that you're guaranteed to need to run, throughout your process. It's really a tool for you to, if you want to look back on a previous data set and you've done some editing and you need to see changes that have been made in a window of time between two data sets, that's when you would use this. So there's, you can run it on individual feature classes, or you can run it at the comparing two geodatabases. So I'll pull this up here, and it tells you what this does. It'll identify changes from two versions of standards compliant geodatabases, and it'll identify attribute changes, spatial edits, as well as added or deleted records. So you put in your two ones that you're trying to compare, geodatabases, and then you would, this creates a new table and you tell it where to go. So I actually have already ran this, and we can look at the results here in a second. But I want to reiterate that this works for standards or data that is in the standard schema. So let's jump over. This tool takes about 15 minutes to run, at least in the data that I've been testing. That's been the average. And I created this table here. I just told it to export in my working geodatabase. And let's open it up. So your results will look like this, where it'll have it'll have the path of the two data sets being compared. In this case, it was the geodatabase, but it'll tell you which actual feature class. So this is the address point from this compared geodatabase. And then I had a second geodatabase, which is this validations geodatabase. And it'll tell you what the edit result is. So it's actually really cool because it'll tell you if there was an attribute edit, and then it'll tell you the field that the edit was made on, okay? And then, of course, our feature ID that we can always jump back, or we can join this table back to our address points and make sure that we can do some comparison, however you're using this tool. But I really like that it tells you that it was an attribute edit, and then it draws your attention to the field to look into of what's changed between the two data sets. If a record has been removed or added, it'll tell you right here, it'll tell you that the record is not in whichever data set, right? So if this address point from a previous version of my data is not found in that previous data set, that means I've added it in my new data set, if that makes sense. And you can always search using this feature ID, okay? And like I said, this is not something that you will likely use all the time, but it is a good tool if you need to see what edits have been made in a window of time as you go throughout your editing, right? Okay. All right, so that concludes the remediation portion. I'm going to pass it off to Annie, and we'll continue wrapping up the course.
Okay, thank you, Becca, for reviewing those remediations. I hope you guys can get some good information out of that and really use those things that Becca showed you to help you get your data cleaned up. Also remember that there is still grant funding available for those of you who feel like this is too big of an effort. There is grant funding available. You have to reach out to the state for that information. So now we're going to talk about the best practices and recommendations. And this is going to be for data management. Okay, so we've been talking about these tools that generate errors and the tools that generate notices. So going forward, when you run your validations, whether you're running it as a check all or on the individual feature classes themselves, you want to prioritize the errors. Okay, because the errors are the ones that prevent submission. So prioritize those errors. Oftentimes, when you see anomalies that are in the thousands, it's because you're missing a field somewhere. Remember that mandatory fields must be populated. You cannot leave blanks or nulls in a mandatory field. They absolutely have to be populated. So often, and you actually could see this in B2, when we ran the validations on that prepped geo database, we had over 10,000 anomalies, but a big chunk of that was that we were missing some fields out of our data. So we had, I think it was at least like 3 different missing fields out of our address points. But what's going to happen is that anomaly is going to flag on every single address point. So where you have a field missing times 3, you're going to have 3 hits on you for every single address point. And that's just on the missing fields. Okay? So often you can resolve a ton of anomalies just by doing a simple field calculation. Another best practice, and I had mentioned this earlier, but I didn't drop it in this slide, is to make sure that you're clearing that table out in between your validation runs. So each time you run it, clear it out. That's going to give you a fresh table to work with. It's not going to stack, keep stacking those if you clear it out each time. Okay, so you have a very clear picture of what you're working with and what you have to clean up. There are some tools that you want to run after editing, and Becca kind of talked about those a little bit earlier. Anytime you're editing or changing anything with your addressing information or your road center lines, like anything having to do with the names, if you have a suffix change or something like that, you want to rerun the calculate label, or even if you're adding in new. If you add in 15 new address points into a subdivision, you want to make sure that you run that calculate label, because remember that calculate label is used for some of the other toolkit functionality, okay? Like the fishbones. You're not going to get your fishbones to run successfully if you don't have that field calculated. The parity, you want to make sure you're running that, like Becca said, as you're editing your data, when you're flipping roads and things like that, you want to run your parity tool. Your NGUID, you want to be mindful about your NGUID when you're editing data, okay? The NGUID is going to duplicate when you split road center lines. It's going to duplicate across the attributes. Just like if you copy and paste address points, that NGUID is also going to be duplicated. So you want to make sure that you are using that NGUID tool, because everything has to be 100% unique. Especially if you do a lot of editing with road center lines and you're splitting and things like that, you definitely want to make sure you rerun that tool. The fishbones, rerun your fishbones after you edit a lot of addresses or road center lines. Again, it is valuable when you're doing address management or maintenance to label the road center lines with not only the name of the road, but also the range. That way, if you're adding a high on there or something, or you need to adjust the range. Rerun your topology when you edit boundaries or you're editing your roads. Run those topologies, the check ESN. There's a lot of tools that you could run after you're editing your data to make sure that the data stays standards compliant. Migrate to the model when possible. If you can adopt the state's model for your own data, then that's going to help you out tremendously. A lot of the smaller, more rural counties will find that this is easier to do because maybe your data is not supporting a lot of business needs, but people who have GIS data integrated into a lot of different enterprise level applications, they're going to have a heavier lift on their hands. okay? Because they're going to have to go back and ask these questions about, you know, well, who's using my data? How's it being used? What fields are being used? Okay, my address field is in this format, but the data model requires it to be, you know, this field type. So how can I manage all of these things and not have to maintain multiple data sets? You're going to have a heavier lift on your hands, okay? Make sure you're validating before submitting to the repository. You can submit to the repository and wing it and let the repository tell you if you passed or failed, but you could also do the same on your computer as well. Any questions, Shelley? Okay. Data maintenance, you want to follow attribution standards, and this was a slide that we had dropped in B2, but it's still relevant as we talk about managing our data. Parsing, the model pretty much forces this. You know, you do need to parse your data going forward. You can't keep everything in one field. Standardizing the street types, again, use that fixed street type and direction tool. It's going to help. It's going to transfer those values into the fully spelled out NINA field values, and then also allow you to copy those legacy values over into the legacy fields. Use true nulls instead of blanks. Your house number should be an integer value. Again, that's kind of forced by the model. Manage your sub-addressing in separate fields. Pack the record, okay? Really strive for perfection in your addressing data and completeness. Don't get down on yourself, though. Remember that the condition of our data is always a reflection of, number one, what the business needs are, and number two, how the data has been managed for however many years you've had that data set, okay? Next Gen 911 requires our data to do something it's never had to do before at a level of accuracy and completeness it's never had to have. So, you know, if you don't have everything, don't get down on yourself. There is help out there. The toolkit is going to help you tremendously to get some of that data where it needs to be. Other things you're going to have to work a little harder on, but this is going to be a really great start for you. Make sure that you're managing consistent data across all of your data sets. You want to make sure that your ESNs are reflected the same in your ESZs and your road center lines and your address points. Now, about the ESNs, that is a conditional field within the state's data model. However, the ESZs are a required field. So my thought process is, why don't you just go ahead and maintain the ESNs in all of your data sets? Again, pack the record. And then with your community values, you want to make sure those are also reflecting the same information. Regarding boundaries, you want to make sure that you resolve topology errors within the data because those will prevent submission, okay? You can use that error inspector tool within ArcGIS to help you resolve your topology errors. One of the things that I would strongly advise you to do is to try to put that NGUID in your SDE data, because that way, when you run the topology on that data, it's at the top and you're not having to redo it every single time. The last thing you want to do is generate a whole new standards compliant geodatabase and not have some way to tie it back to your SDE, because you don't want to have to go through and mark exceptions on 600 cul-de-sacs, you know, each time you want to prep your data for submission. Okay, so these are the thoughts that you have to have when you're going through and planning for this. Also remember that your GIS and your PSAP must work together. You have to work together to resolve anomalies. These are PSAP decisions. GIS folks, you don't want this on your shoulders. Put it on the PSAP folks. And then, of course, when you download the PSAP and discrepancy agency boundaries, review them thoroughly. Have routine meetings with your PSAP to go through these areas, bring in your neighbors if you need to, and then if any adjustments are needed, well, bringing in your neighbors is actually part of that adjustment process by the state, but make sure that you engage the state if you need to adjust that boundary. Because again, it may look identical to your county boundary, but does that mean it's correct for call routing? Okay, these are the questions you need to ask of your data. Okay, so the next steps, again, this was a holdover from the last class, but I think it still applies. You might want to consider strategic planning because that's going to give you a really good insight into your data quality, your addressing workflows, all these different things that are part of NG9-1-1, whether you realize it or not, okay? Have a data maintenance plan. How are you going to maintain your data going forward? And that is going to include ongoing QA and QC. Whether you choose to clean this up yourself or use a vendor, you need to understand that this is not just a one and done. You can hire a vendor and give them $1 bajillion to do your data. If they hand it back to you in clean condition and you go back to poor editing habits, guess what? Your data is now messed up again. Junk in, junk out. And if you're not sure how to maintain your data for NG9-1-1, reach out. There are people who can help you, okay? Okay, so Shelly, since you're our only classmate member, our questions for you. What's next for you? What are your needs? What do you need from the state to assist in your efforts to get ready for NG9-1-1? And also, do you identify any gaps within the toolkit that you'd like to see? And I know you haven't had a chance to really work within it, but these are the questions that Charles wanted us to ask. Charles, she said she has you, so she's got it all. She's got everything she ever wanted. I don't know if he's still on. He had someone come into his office, so. Okay. Well, if you see anything, and this is, I guess, for Shelly and for anybody else watching the recording, if you have any additional needs, if you see any issues within the toolkit, if you think of any functionality that you would like to see in the toolkit that's not there currently, then you should definitely reach out to Shelly and let her know, and that will be communicated to the developers. So if there are no other questions or comments, you don't have anything for us, Shelly? Okay. Then I guess we can conclude. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I thank you all for watching this recording and being with us, even if only virtually. And yeah, good luck with the toolkit.